Hey everyone, in this video I want to explore the way to manage Azure AD and actually other services using the Microsoft Graph and also using that Microsoft Graph SDK through PowerShell. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment and share is appreciated, and hit that bell icon. Now when I do think about Azure AD, it's gone through this history of PowerShell management. It had its own kind of management endpoint. It would get used, the graph.windows.net. We had an Azure AD PowerShell module. Then there was an Azure AD Preview PowerShell module. Then there was this Azure AD Standard Preview that was available in the Cloud Shell. And they really were moving between the different APIs, the authentication libraries. And where we are right now, we're at a brand new actual API, this one API that everything is moving to. If I quickly jumped over and actually looked at some code, what I can see in here is, if I just go and look for, well, what are the Azure AD modules? And the first two I see is kind of this, well, this Azure AD and this Azure AD Preview. Then we had, again, that Azure AD .standard.preview that was found in the Microsoft Cloud Shell. But also remember, just using the Azure Resources module, the az.resources, there are a bunch of Azure AD commands I can do from there. If I look at this bottom command here, so this is just with the Azure, the AZ PowerShell module, we see there's a whole bunch of things I can do about users, applications, service principals, groups. So here, if I just do a look at the users, well, there we go. I see a list of users available. I can look at various groups that I have in the tenant. I can get a particular group. Here I'm just doing a search and then look at, well, who is in that group. I can look at my applications. So I can interact pretty well just using the Azure module. So there are times we want to do more things. We want more information, more detail. And that's what I really want to focus on today, because if we look back in time, we have all these different services actually available as part of the Microsoft Cloud. Now, there's obvious ones. Obviously, a focus here is Azure AD. So if I think about, well, Azure AD, we have users, which can include things like service principals. So kind of say service principals and users. We have groups. We have applications. We have all these different things that are part of Azure AD. And what we historically would use to talk to that is we had the Azure AD Authentication Library. So this would actually go and talk to Azure AD, which had its own API endpoint. We would go and talk to graph.windows.net. So there was a particular endpoint for Azure AD. Then, of course, we also had things like just Microsoft accounts. So this is my kind of casual, wearing a baseball cap. But this could be my MSA, i.e. a live account. Well, that had its own API. That had this, I think it was apis.live.net. So if I wanted to go and talk to that API, well, that was that address. Then we can think about, well, email. I'm using Exchange Online, for example. So I might have email, I might have calendaring. Well, that had its own set of APIs as well. So, okay, we go outlook.office.com. And you can see this kind of carried on. Hey, I could have things like OneDrive for Business. Well, that was something .sharepoint. You think there's Teams, there's Intune, there's all these different services kind of available, which is really not ideal. We don't want all these different things that interact differently. So the whole point about this Microsoft Graph is a shift to one API to rule them all. And so while this was very limited, the idea now is we have this new Microsoft Graph. And it tries to show the idea that everything has this interconnection if you actually look at its kind of symbol. So its symbol looks terrible drawing, something like this. But all of these different points of connection is all based around the idea that, hey, it's connected to everything. Everything is interconnected with everything else. I'll go over there as well, whatever that logo actually looks like. So this one API now, so I can think about this HTTPS graph, and now it's just .microsoft.com. This can talk to everything. So this one API now talks to all of the services, Teams, Intune, Microsoft accounts, Azure AD, Outlook, Calendar, tasks, if I had like the various tasks to do capabilities, OneDrive for Business, everything through this one API. And optionally, there's obviously an SDK as well. Now I can obviously talk through a RESTful interface directly, or there is an SDK, software development kit for various languages, and actually there's a PowerShell meta module that goes through the SDK that talks to that graph as well. So we now have this new way of doing things. And actually as part of this, and when we think about Azure AD, you may have heard of this, the Azure AD Authentication Library. Well, now there's also the idea of this Microsoft Authentication Library, which uses the new graph, which supports both Azure AD and the Microsoft accounts. So we have this new option that supports both of those things. Okay, so we've got this new great graph that supports everything. If I think about interacting with all these different types of services, I can think about me as an individual. So all of these services here, well, there's me. Me has certain data. Me has a certain profile in Azure AD. Me has certain mail items. Me has certain calendar appointments. Me has certain files. So there's acting as me, and then there's thinking about the entire organization. Don't know how to draw an organization, but this could be, for example, Saviltech. So sometimes I'm interacting as me. Sometimes I'm interacting as the organization. And they're two very different things. Because everything we're going to see in graph is all about, well, try and make this just a little bit pretty. It's all about scope. Ordinarily, if I just think about an account, I just have a certain set of privileges that are always kind of available to me. When I'm dealing with the graph, I set a scope. There are a huge amount of different permissions available, and I have to tell it which permissions do I want at any particular time. Because we want least privilege. We don't just get every permission we possibly have. If we think about it, the graph is kind of an application, and it's going to perform certain things. We're going to delegate, hey, this can do certain things on our behalf. So it's really important to understand what is the operation I'm performing against this graph API, and what permissions does it actually need? Because I need to make sure my current token has that permission by setting the right scope. Now I can go and look at the documentation. So if I jump over here, for example, I want to do a list methods for, this is authentication methods. It's saying, well, hey, there are these different permissions available, and it's showing me what they are. And it's saying, well, look, there's permissions when you're acting as you. Okay, so when I'm acting as me, there's this user authentication method read, user authentication method read write. And then there's the idea of acting on other users, kind of at an org level. And then we see there's this change that it's a read.all, a read-write.all. And then I can actually be applications as well. Now, one of the key things to remember is that I'm talking about running these things as me. Most of the time, you're actually going to have some service maybe running as a service principal that's doing some things on behalf of itself. It has a certain permissions, but it might also be operating on behalf of the user. So it's kind of getting delegated permissions. Remember, whenever something is delegating a permission, it's doing something on behalf of us, we have to consent and say, yes, it can actually have that permission. Now, I've actually gone and used some of this stuff already. And what's actually interesting, and I'm going to kind of show in this a bit more detail, but if I was to just jump over for a second, so is this me? So this is my session. If I actually go and open up the My Apps, so if I go to myapps.microsoft.com, which will actually go to my applications now, we can always look at the applications we have delegated permissions to. In this case, if I go and look at all apps, you're going to see a couple of graph applications here. So you notice I've got kind of Graph Explorer. I've got Graph Explorer official site. And then there's the Microsoft Graph PowerShell. Now, if I focus on this Graph PowerShell, if I click these little three dots right here, from that I can say Manage the application. And that will now show me the permissions I have consented to, because I've obviously run this before. I've been testing this. So I can see I've consented to say how I can send email as me. It can sign in as me, my profile, access to data, read audit log data. So I've consented to some very specific permissions, and we'll see why. Now, there's also some permissions that the admin has to consent to. Remember the scope. Remember the idea that if the scope is at an organizational level, I as a regular user would not have permission to give an application the permission to do something at the org level. I can give it permission to do things of data I own, all those green things, but if it's saying organizational wide, I probably don't have that. So what would happen is an administrator would have to actually go and give that consent. And so that's what we kind of see on these other permissions your admin consented to. And there's a whole bunch of other things. Basic profiles, read all groups, read write directory data, tasks, all user profiles, read write all groups, read all user authentication methods, a whole list of things. And that's because, hey, I've been testing this, I've tried different commands, I'm going to show you some of these. So it had to have those additional permissions to do the different types of operation I was performing. So we have this one API that has different basic operations to perform against the various services. I have to have the right permission, the right scope to be able to perform those various types of things. Now I could get started in PowerShell, but really a nice way of doing this is there are some fantastic, and I've got links in the description, there is some fantastic documentation. There's also a really nice Graph Explorer that lets me kind of go and play around. So I'm going to jump over to the Graph Explorer. And in that Graph Explorer, without doing anything else, we can kind of see, well, I could sign in, but even without signing in, it has a bunch of getting started things. Now, I want you to take note. There's like get, post, put, patch, delete, and there's an API version. Now, this is doing V1. What we're going to switch to later on is the beta. Gives me access to some different things, and you'll see in the API, the URI I'm using, it changes to beta instead of 1.0. And it gives me some basic things. Hey, I could look at my profile, I could look at my photo. This is not signed in as me, so that really doesn't look like me. That's how. I could look at the profile data. There's a whole bunch of different pieces of information actually down here in this. Now what I'm going to do is I actually sign in. So I'm going to sign in as Graph Explorer. So now it's actually operating as me and my organization. So for example, from here, I could say, well, let's go and look at users. And I might say, show me all the guest users in the organization. Notice what it's done to the API. It's looking at the users part, and it's adding a filter, user type equals guest. I can run that, and that is returning me all of the guest users. in my organization. I could get user by email, I could look at group information, but it's showing me the API it's using to actually do this. Now, additionally, it's showing me code snippets. So that wasn't a good example right now. Let's just pick a more general one. So all users, all groups, I could run that, but it shows me code snippets, response headers, toolkit. But notice what it's actually complaining about. Hey, you need to consent to the permissions on the Modify Permissions Preview tab. So I'm trying to run a command right now, an API that I don't have permission. I've not scoped it at that yet. So I could go to Modify Permissions, and it's showing me, look, you need to consent to give it these things. Now, admin consent is required. Well, I am an admin. So I could go and consent, and it's saying, hey, this is this consent. So it's telling me, hey, the application is Graph Explorer official site. Remember, we saw that in the My Apps. When we went to My Apps, Graph Explorer official site. So it's asking for some additional permissions. So I think I've locked out my little box. Where's it go? There we go. I could say accept, and I can consent on behalf of my organization. And I could go through, do all of these different things. Now, likewise, for all of this, again, this is kind of a service principle. I'm not going to go for all of these right now. I can actually do this on behalf of other credentials. So imagine I did have an application. So I have, for example, an app registration, and I'm just going to pick, doesn't really matter which one. But remember, we have the idea of API permissions over here. Now, this is where I can add permissions. Now, if I add a permission, it asks me for which API. So I'm going to say Microsoft.graph. And then it's going to say, is this a permission the application runs with just itself, an app permission, or is it a permission that's delegated? It's running on behalf of the other person. So I can tell it, hey, these are the things. And notice, this is going to be like an admin level, for example. Does it require admin consent? Yes or no? And I can go through and consent those actually on behalf of the application. But what we can basically see here is I can go down, I can do these various things, and I can get data. Now you'll notice other things would fail. For example, if I tried to maybe look at identity and access, and I tried to maybe list Azure AD devices, that fails as well. I don't have the right permissions. I would have to go and consent to all of these different things. So all the time, I'm using these different APIs. There's this RESTful interface I can use. So for my app, I could do that. You get the idea. But the whole key point of all of this, I can really do anything I want, but I have to make sure it's requested the right scope and it has permission to actually do that. And again, if it's something for the whole organization, it's just a regular security principle, it would not have permission. I would have to go and kind of do that on behalf of the application as an administrator. So now let's think back to kind of our scenario and maybe a bit more focus on Azure AD and kind of doing this from PowerShell. Well, obviously, from PowerShell, I can call, and I just realized I wrote SP instead of PS, PowerShell. I can call a RESTful interface. So let's do that. So if I jump back over to the code, something I can do very simply is, well, I'm already authenticated to the Azure Resource Manager. So I can actually say, hey, look, I want another token. Give me a token for that graph, the Microsoft Graph API, a resource URL of graph.microsoft.com. So it's going to generate me a token for that. I can then generate an authentication header with that token in it as the bearer token. And now, technically, I can just invoke REST methods. Do you remember that same API call we made to get the guests? Well, I don't actually have to change anything. I can just call that same query. And if I execute that and look at the response value, I get the same for users. So I could absolutely just call this very easily from my PowerShell. But I don't really want to do that. So there's actually a Microsoft Graph SDK PowerShell module I can actually use. Now we can actually go and look at the documentation over here. So there it's telling me about the Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK. I can go and get it from the gallery. It's called Microsoft.graph. It tells me how to update it, how to install it, and it actually gives me the basic connection commands as well, in addition to connecting as a certificate. So if I was using a service principal, I'm going to connect using a certificate. And notice it's kind of showing me the idea of connecting with some scopes. But we'll come back to that. The other thing I want you to remember is this samples folder, because this is actually super, super nice. Now back to my little code. Now I can search. So if I do a find module, we can see down here in the bottom, it will find it. This is going to the PowerShell gallery, and it will say, hey, okay, I found this latest version 1.6 of Microsoft.graph. I could install it for all users, and I can check what do I actually have installed. So I can see, yep, I've got version 1.6. And I can just run connect mggraph. Now I already have a token on this machine, so it didn't open up a browser, it didn't do anything else, it just kind of worked. Now I can use the same types of things as any other kind of application. I could connect using a certificate. I could actually use, I think there's a device flow option over here, so use device authentication, so it would kind of give me a code and I can use that way. So there's all different ways I can actually authenticate. But a key point, remember, every API has certain scopes it requires. Now I can look at what I currently have. Now firstly, do you remember I changed the version from 1.0 to beta in the portal? I'm going to do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to change the profile to beta. And I can look at my current scope. So this is showing me my current context, and I can actually list out just the scopes. So I'm just running this kind of command right here. And it's going to show me all the scopes I have. So I actually have a big collection because I've done a bunch of tests on this already, and they've got basically added. I can do incremental consent. So it's going to add additional things as I ask for other things. Now I could disconnect this and kind of start from fresh. But here, these are all the different scopes that are currently as part of my token. So any API that needs any kind of these, I'm going to be good to go. Once again, there's different clouds, so I can do basic things like look at the different environments, so US Gov, DoD, China, Germany, the global. And I really want to stress that example folder I just showed. These have, again, my focus is Azure AD, but there's samples on here for thinking about teams and sites and drives and conditional access, sending email, tenant information. Go and look at these samples. They are really good. And my focus is Azure AD, but you might want to do other things. So I can do all of those other things using this Microsoft.graph. Exchange management, teams management, tasks. I'm just focusing on Azure AD. Now I can get information about my tenant. Here I can say, hey, okay, there are my different verified domains. I could say, what plans do I have? Okay, I can see the different plans I have associated with my various tenant. I can see the service plan ID, the service, when it was added. So let's start doing some things. Users, get MG user. Well, I can go and look at all my different users. I can filter. Now, when I do a filter, what did we have in that RESTful API call that I called initially? We had a filter. Now, one thing to bear in mind in PowerShell. In PowerShell, dollar is basically a character I use to define a variable. So I had to escape it with the little tick sign. So if we actually zoom in for a second, because I use dollar, I have to add this character in front of the dollar to basically say, look, escape the dollar, just use it as a regular dollar, don't try and make it into a variable, because then it will ignore the filter. So that's why that worked when I called the RESTful API. But I can take that exact same filter, user type equals guest, and I can pass it as the filter for filter. And that's where that portal is actually really nice. It has a whole bunch of different examples in that Graph Explorer. So if I'm trying to work out how to do something, I could go and look at some of these sample queries it gives you, look at the URI, and then add that into when I'm actually calling with PowerShell. So if I now just run this, what do I expect it to do? Exactly the same. The same for users. It's doing the same thing. Now I could look, for example, at inactive users. For example, here I'm looking at the sign-in activity, last sign-in date time is less than kind of over a month ago. But to do that, I have to be able to read all from the audit log. Now, I've already run that command. So I should be able to run this, and it's fine. It gives me the output. But if you had not done this yet, if you had never set that scope, you would have to run this command first. I would have to go and connect with that scope to now be actually able to get and read from that audit log. So the different APIs require different things, different information. And just like any PowerShell, I can chain things together. For example, hey, I could maybe get the user ID. Let's see what this one does. I think I just dump out the ID. Right, so here I just dump out the IDs of kind of various users of the groups they're in. So get MG user member of is giving me the group IDs of every group all of these inactive users are in. I could even do things like disable them. I'm not going to do this. Now what I found was interesting. So we have an update MG user and it has account enabled, but you can't set it to false. But it does have a settings option. And a settings option is just wanting a hash table of attributes. So I created a hash table with a single attribute here that's just doing account enabled equals to false, and I'm performing that update. So here I'd be looking for the unused users and then disable them. I can view service principals, get MG service principal. I could view groups. So you can see I can do all the same things I would normally think about with Azure AD. Hey, I can do them using this PowerShell module for the Microsoft Graph SDK. I could go and look at memberships. So here I'm getting a group whose display name equals Justice League. Now the way I'm doing it in the first example is, well, I'm just getting all groups and then going through them where the display name equals Justice League. So that works. Or more efficiently is in the request here, I'm adding a filter, display name equals Justice League. So I'm only going to get returned the actual group. So I'm actually going to use that one. And then because I've now got the group as an object, I can say, hey, well, show me all the members of that group. And notice what this kind of long line is doing. It's looking at the group members, so it's going to get a whole bunch of IDs, this first command. And then I want to substitute the ID into basically a parameter user ID, which gets passed through to get user, so it's going to get it for that ID. And then I'm selecting the ID, display name, and the email. So that's what these kind of using that pipeline to pass through different values to get me the information I actually want. Likewise, will give me the owner of the group. The owner of the group is me. I can get authentication methods. I could find out, hey, using the Microsoft Authenticator app. Are you using email authentication? And I may just not know what I want to do. So in this case, I'm actually searching all of the different modules that make up Microsoft.graph. For example, if I just do a get module, let's do list available Microsoft.graph.star, we kind of see it's a meta module. There's a whole bunch of different modules that get installed when I install Microsoft.graph. So what I'm saying is I want to do something about licensing, but I really don't know the right command. So I'm saying, look, get me the command for anything that's a child of Microsoft.graph. The noun, well, it contains license, and I want to know about getting, so the verb is get. So show me everything about getting something about licensing. Well, then it shows me all the different commandlets I can use about licensing. And we see one of those is, well, we'll get MG license detail. That might be what I want. So then I can try that and see, well, what licenses does John have? Well, these are all the licenses John has. So it really is pretty friendly to actually use. So go and look around, look at the commands. You can use that graph API to kind of learn and try the different things. And really what's happening is the SDK maps to those various API calls. PowerShell is just calling the SDK. So that's kind of the relationship. Tiny little bit of fun, just one other thing we can do. So if we go back over to our kind of code for a second, just to show the idea that I can do anything. You could write an application that goes and gets users' calendar appointments, checks their to-dos, sends an email. So I'm going to create a message, subject fortress beats cave. Your fortress is way better than a cave filled with bat poop. I'm sending it to clark@saviltech.net. So I can create this object. And then, well, I need to send an email. So now my scope has to have mail.send. So I'm going to get that scope. Now to just show you, when I try and request a scope I don't currently have. So if I run this calendars.readWrite, it's going to pop up a consent box. And it's going to say, hey, look, the Microsoft Graph PowerShell is now asking for these things. Do you want to accept that? I'm just going to cancel it so I can always demo that again in the future. But that's what will kind of happen if it's not already been pre-consented. Notice it's failed, so I would not be able to do read write to my calendar now. And now I can just send the mail message. So it's sending it as me, that message. Now if I look at Clark, well, Clark just got an email from me. So it gives you an idea. Through that API, I can really do anything related to all those different services. OneDrive for Business, SharePoint, Teams, Mail, Calendar, Azure AD, all of those different things I can operate through. And then because we have this link as well then through the SDK and the PowerShell, I can do those things from there as well. So that's it. I mean, that's really what I wanted to show is just, hey, when we think about the future direction of management, it's all through this new one Microsoft Graph API. We have the SDK, we have PowerShell. So if I'm narrowly thinking of just Azure AD, this is my path, the Microsoft Graph PowerShell module. But also realize it can do so much more. So until next time, take care.